Hello and welcome to the Buffalo stage and to day 2 of Africa Energy Week 2025. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure, Hanan Farjani, your master of ceremony for this day 2 of the Africa Energy Transition Summit. It's my pleasure to welcome you. I am excited and delighted to be continuing and building momentum on the conversations that took place yesterday. And we have a bold and dynamic morning ahead of us. Yesterday, we set the stone for bold discussions on how Africa can drive its own destiny in terms of energy and its trajectory as a whole. Today, we build on that momentum, diving into sovereignty, investment, infrastructure, and decarbonization. This stage is where some of the biggest questions about Africa's energy transition pathways will be explored, and hopefully where some of the solutions that we hope to find will be taken. Now, before we begin, let me give you a few quick reminders. For some of you that have been here since the beginning of this conference, you might know this, but we have 5 strategic conference stages running in parallel, from the town hall at Elephant Stage to upstream at Lion Stage, and technical workshops on the exhibition floor. So do explore these different offerings during the breaks, or just check the agenda. If you have particular interests, you can go see these different conversations or workshops. We also have headsets that should be on your seats, but also you can go to the technical team in the back to ask for them, and you have live translation that is available in English and French. And please remember, ladies and gentlemen, to keep your phones off during these proceedings and join the conversation online using our hashtags. That's hashtag AEW25 and hashtag African Energy Week. Now, with that, let's set the stage for our first session this morning. We mode into our first dialogue, harnessing Africa's resource wealth to establish energy sovereignty. Africa holds immense energy wealth, we know that, yet access remains limited. This conversation asks, how do we leverage governance, resilience, and innovation to move from dependency to sovereignty? To guide us through this roundtable discussion, I'm going to welcome our esteemed moderator, and she'll then call up her panelists. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming her warmly. This is Eleanor Okubor. She's expert associate partner at McKinsey and Company. Please, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for her.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome once again. Africa holds immense wealth, yet many millions of us remain without access, and we depend on external sources for our energy needs. Today's panel is going to explore how Africa can achieve energy sovereignty, harnessing our resources, strengthening partnerships, governance, while attracting private and international investments. All of this while ensuring climate resilience and inclusive growth. So let me introduce our distinguished panelists. We have His Excellency Tarek Molla. He's the founder and principal consultant, Luminant Energy, the former Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources of Egypt. We have Rita Jo Lewis, the former chair, board of directors, president and CEO of the Export-Import Bank of the United States. Morning. Wole Lawi, the chief investment officer at the Africa Development Bank. And we have Lungile Mashele, a sector specialist in mining, beneficiation, and energy at the Public Investment Corporation. Good morning. Great. So we're going to jump right in, if you don't mind. And I'm going to start with Your Excellency. So as we look ahead towards the next decade, what does true energy sovereignty for Africa look like, and how do you think it would reshape our global positioning?
Thank you, Eleanor, for this important question. Thank you for inviting us at this important panel discussing different challenges for African future for energy. Actually, when we talk about sovereignty, we talk about, and we have to cover several points. We need to talk about unlocking and interlocking the capabilities of the Africans, which would include really how Africa could build the capabilities of the continent that will shift from a net consumer of imported goods, technology, and commodities into a supplier of clean, green energy, minerals, and manufactured goods. Manufactured goods would be perhaps petroleum products, could be part of the supply chain value, and not only just receiving end products. We have also to understand that the energy sovereignty would have two meanings, really. We talk about self-sufficiency, when Africa would be self-sufficient, and when we talk about self-sufficiency, we need to talk about how we would be able to supply our African people with electricity, access to clean cooking, and this is something very important that is needed for Africans, as well as strategic sovereignty regarding how we can get our bargaining power. Bargaining power wouldn't come unless we fulfill these two challenges. Really, true energy sovereignty would be a blend of stable domestic supply together with a regulatory and diplomatic capacity to shape external relationships with African countries. So this is something that we need to capitalize on, and we need to make sure that if we put a plan for the coming 10 years for Africa, that they could focus on combining the universal access, strong regional markets, local value chains. I think that energy sovereignty will be the ability to power African economies. And this is very important, that the combination will transform Africa's role from marginal to really a maker, a decision maker for the global energy and geopolitics. Thank you.
From the standpoint of global trade and finance, how do you see Africa's energy transformation influencing capital flows internationally, and what sort of partnerships do you foresee in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, first of all, it's just good to be able to be here at this session, and also to be here with partners like Wally and the minister and others. Primarily, I like to jump right into the numbers. And the numbers, to me, tell the story. Having led an institution, most recently the U.S. Export-Import Bank, for approximately over 3 years, one of the things I look at is where we started and where we ended. And I was in New York, like so many of us, recently during UNGA, and was at one of the sessions, and they really talked about that $1.9 trillion financing gap that's going to be needed to fill the gap, to do all of the types of projects that have been discussed throughout this meeting. When you look at that gap, you say, how are we going to get there? Well, first of all, it's about commitment for whatever institution that you're leading or that you're involved in. We started out 3 years ago and had only done about 109 million. 3 years later, we ended up having financed on the continent $3.6 billion. I say that with some sense of pride. However, it's still not enough. And the reason why it's not enough, because you have to look at these institutions like independent credit agencies like EXIM as the fact that even though as an organization, our US Congress endowed us with $135 billion, they also gave us mandates that we had to meet. We had to meet the mandate of a 20% of the financing in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as with some other mandates we had around renewables and small business, and also around infrastructure. So I will tell you that when I say that jump into the numbers, I always like to say, how are we going to get there? one of the mandates that we had, or one of the things that was our guiding force, was that we were there to crowd in capital. You can't crowd out the capital. And I see, and what I've seen on the continent, is that the partnerships is really going to be where the action is going to be in order to fill the financing gap that we need. And so, you know, having partners like AFDB and DF and AfriExim Bank and Africa 50 and AFC are just some of the organizations on the continent that we actually did agreements with and tried to work very aggressively on numerous projects. To me, that's where the norm is going to be. How do we actually syndicate, starting with some of our export credit agencies and our DFCs, our development finance corporations, to me is going to become the norm, because we're going to be blending, using concessional, commercial, and private equity. The other thing that we had to be cognizant of, and I think this is where the mandate came in, is that the supply chain is coming to Africa, no matter how we look at it. The thing that's important is that, especially in areas around critical minerals processing, and so organizations like export credit agencies can offer, which U.S. did, longer tenor export credit, performance insurance, and also award offtake prepayments. But at the end of the day, when you look throughout the next 5 to 10 years, no conversation starts and ends without the discussion around jobs. And so that is going to be, I think, central. As we talk about financing, we're going to also talk about job creation here on the continent.
I'm going to come back to Your Excellency. Just a very quick question. From a governance perspective, what are some of the most persistent barriers to Africa fully harnessing her energy resources?
Well, this is an important question that we need to highlight actually the answer, because really governance would really could be an enabler and would help really to harness the energy resource of Africa, which we are talking all about unlocking the potential of Africa's resources. So actually it's a layer and a mix and combination of several I would say actions. I mean, regulatory, political, and infrastructure constraints. And these are the three important barriers that I would say that would prevent the harnessing. So when we talk about regulatory barriers, it could really vary from policy uncertainty, inconsistency, and sometimes this means frequent shifts of energy policies through government change. Sometimes weak regulatory independence, where regulators really lack of autonomy, and there is also fragmentation of rules, where there is no inconsistencies, undeveloped markets, where you can see that some countries, some places, there are no competitive wholesale or retail market for different energy resource like electricity. This is one of the barriers. Second barrier, I would say, the political side. And when we talk about political barriers, we would go into geopolitical tensions. Sometimes we see neighboring countries have got some challenges, some differences, and this is really leading to some of the barriers. Also, short-term political cycles. When we talk about long-term strategic infrastructure projects versus mid-term quick wins for election purposes or whatever. So this is also some of the challenges that we can see in the political side. Resource nationalism versus investor opening market. So these are some of the political side. The last important barrier would be the infrastructure. And sometimes when we talk about infrastructure, we can see that when we talk about electricity transmissions, we see that there are oftenly, and in many of our countries, grid limitations, and that cannot. So if there is a capacity to develop power and generation of power, but there is a limitation to transfer it through the grid. Under investing in the storage and flexibility of the maneuvering of the storing capacities. So this is also something that is lacking in Africa in general, and poor regional interconnections. We have a limited cross-border transmission, and really this is something that also is leading to important barriers. So therefore, I think that clarifying these these barriers and putting them as a priority would, in my opinion, override the challenges for harnessing the resources of Africa. So when we are able to align the policies and the regulations together with the infrastructure, I think that we'll be able really to have the reforms and to reach the target that we are aiming for. Accordingly, I think that we'll be able to unlock the investments and the infrastructure development while also reducing political interference. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you. Molla, His Excellency started talking about infrastructure being one of the barriers. So from your investment lens, what are some of the most promising yet underfunded opportunities in climate resilient projects? And where do you see, what innovations do you see as the most bankable?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, I mean, there are many promising opportunities, but I'll just pick three of them. One is in the distributed renewable energy space. The idea of deploying solar home systems and mini-grids in rural environments and peri-urban environments, right? And I think for many countries, the idea of investing thousands or billions of dollars in hundreds of kilometers of transmission lines to get power to a remote village is not necessarily the most economical. And I think for a continent that has some of the best solar irradiation resources in the world, particularly around the Sahel region where 250 million people don't have electricity access, I think that distributed renewable energy makes sense. The challenge with that is that the funding models that exist are not robust enough to support that industry. You know, they require long-term funding, they require local currency funding, which isn't available cheaply in many African countries. So what's needed is a real pooling together of various platforms so that we can invest at scale as DFIs. And also if you can add some sort of results-based financing to that equation, you can further attract private investor capital. The second area is battery energy storage. As countries look to decarbonize and add more solar, wind onto their grids, what people often forget is that the more renewable energy you add onto the grid, the more unstable your grid becomes because of the intermittency. So what you need is battery energy storage across your grid so that there's more stability and you can add renewables. And you're seeing South Africa, for instance, undertake a battery energy storage procurement program right now to achieve that purpose. I'll give an example of where we have done that. So if you take the country of Cape Verde probably relies on about 70 or 80% of generation coming from thermal power plants, which require imported diesel and heavy fuel oils, which is quite expensive for the country. So one thing that we have done is that we have financed battery energy storage across 4 of Cape Verde's islands. And ultimately that allows them to reduce the level of thermal generation on the islands and reduce the cost of electricity for its citizens. We also provided concessional financing through a special trust fund called the Sustainable Energy Trust Fund for Africa, which essentially provided financing at somewhere around 75 to 100 basis points, all in to support the battery storage. And then the third area of opportunity is in building climate resilient grid infrastructure. African countries suffer from various natural disasters, floods, heat waves, cyclones, and the like. So there is a need to strengthen the transmission and distribution infrastructure, and I'm aligned with the perspective that His Excellency Tarek Molla gave. which is that, that's a priority. And if we can add in cross-border connectivity as well, that can unlock several opportunities for African countries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Do you wanted to add something?
Well, I guess the next question you ask is what technologies are the most bankable?
Yeah.
I think in some ways it's a difficult question to answer because bankability depends on so many different things, right? It depends on the robustness of your project finance contracts, your political risk, the certainty of your cash flows. So from that perspective, I wouldn't say there's one technology more bankable than another. But what I will say is that there is a correlation between the reducing cost of that technology and how bankable it ultimately becomes. If you look, for instance, at solar PV, when that first kicked off, it required all manner of concessional financing, grants, subsidies, and the like. But now, solar power is virtually a commodity. So hopefully the likes of green hydrogen and battery energy storage would go the same way with time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lungile, before I pivot back to others, for you as an institutional investor, what decision-making frameworks guide you when you're weighing risks, returns, and social outcomes, as we piggyback off what Wale just said?
So I think I must be very clear in saying that investors, funders, lenders, DFIs, whatever it is that you want to call them, they chase returns. And that is the driving force, that is why they actually exist. Where you will find some differentiation is the level of return that they're looking for, and then they will of course take risk-adjusted returns. So as an institutional investor, if I'm looking at a project, the very first thing is looking at a national level and trying to understand what does the national development plan require of that particular country, the integrated resource plan, the integrated energy plan. We truly believe, and I think I echo most lenders, especially African-based lenders, when I say we truly believe in the energy security and sovereignty of those nations. So we never go in trying to impose anything else. We also then look at the developmental impact because you are looking at being an impact investor. Are there going to be jobs? Are there going to be black people employed in the case of South Africa in particular? Are there going to be young people employed? How are you addressing the socio-economic as well as enterprise development needs that are required in those areas? The PIC, for instance, is technology agnostic. And I suppose this goes into Waller's point about which is more bankable or less bankable. And the answer is really around, am I going to be able to get the returns that I'm looking for? So, he made a brilliant example about solar becoming cheaper and it's more bankable for certain institutions. For institutional investors, it has become so the returns are so low now that we cannot participate anymore. And so you sort of leave that up to your DFIs and some of your commercial banks. And this is how we also differentiate amongst each other in terms of who's going to be looking at what projects. And then of course, lastly, but certainly not least, we do look at your PIC, your ESG requirements, environmental, social safeguards, governance, who's on the board, are there women on that board, are there young people on that board, what are the environmental issues, what are the mitigants that have been proposed. So it's a myriad of things that we basically look at.
Speaking from the government side and political side, what forms of political will or governance reforms are, in your perspective, most critical to unlock large-scale investments, whether from DFIs or institutional investors? And you mentioned, regional collaboration, cross-border infrastructure. Can regional policy harmonization boost investor confidence?
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor. Actually, this is also to capitalize on what we started our discussion earlier to talk about the will and the real belief from government into reforms in order to attract more investments. So I would say that crucial reforms and political will would go if we fulfill several conditions and several actions, among which we talk about contract, we respect our contracts, the rule of law, and when we talk about this, we can give some examples. When we have to respect, I would say, the power purchase agreements, when we have any arbitration that is not negotiable, so we have to enforce them. Consistent track record in upholding contracts. This is something very important to give confidence to investors. Secondly, when we talk about depoliticizing the tariffs and the regulators, so we should not mix between an independent regulator and independent tariffs that we put, and between the policies for the sake of gaining popularity for elections or whatever. So this has to be really very well maintained at two different separate tracks. Utility and governance reforms, and this is something very important also when we need to unbundle the state corporations, while sometimes in most of our countries they both hold the role of a regulator, at the same time they are the state corporation. So we need to separate both roles to identify and segregate duties. Transparency and anti-corruption, this is very well understood, and this is something that foreign investment needs to believe that there is really transparency in all the process, from the time they put their offer until the tender ends, and then until they would be awarded, for example. Then we need to look at long-term vision over short-term projects or quick wins. And this is something that governments need to look for long-term in order to ensure long-term project for infrastructure and for the welfare and the well-being and the benefit of the people, rather than targeting quick wins projects short-term in order to cover some political needs on an urgent basis. The second thing we talk about is the governments that would be needed to unlock also the investments. And when we talk about that, as we say, we need to have independent regulators, we need to have financial reforms. And when we would like to attract multilateral financial institutes, they need to make sure that they are there at the proper fiscal terms and a proper field for them to come. Because when we attract multilateral and ECAs, they will be able to attract investment funds and as well as other investment banking. So another point is very important is also the procurement process. Procurement system needs to be transparent and needs to be approached on digital basis and not having the opaque and not clear process that is sometimes followed. Currency and payment risk, and this is something that also most of our countries would need to have what we call the deregulated and free exchange rates that would also encourage more of investors, while they can have their investment secured, and whenever they would like to have their dividends sent overseas, that would be easily done. I think that as we were talking about regional harmonization as well among the African countries, I think that we need to ensure that we coordinate together between the countries rather than having this fragmented policies, and we would like to see them united or at least harmonized together so we can capitalize on bigger markets. And I would say that This will de-risk and de-risk all capital and as well as attract global projects. Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you. And so we've heard some of the frameworks from Lungile, but also the role of politicians and the government. So I'm going to come back to you, Wale. When allocating capital, how do you then balance energy access, climate resilience, and economic growth? I mean, we've talked about you're looking for returns, right? But how do you balance those three things? And what role could blended finance and any public-private partnerships play in that?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we have to recognize the fact that different countries are at various stages in their energy transition journey and their industrialization journey, right? So you can't take a country like Mozambique, which has a GDP of 20 billion, low electricity access rates, low industrialization, and is probably contributing less than 0.1% to global climate change, and then hold that country to the same standard as Germany. So that's absolutely unfair, and from my perspective, energy access, industrialization is paramount for African countries. Having said that, I also asked the question, why should there be a balance between energy access, economic growth, and climate resilience? Why can't you have all three at once? And I believe that you can. At AFDB, when we look at the pipeline of projects that we can finance in a given country, we prioritize the projects with the most electricity access at the most affordable cost. And when it comes to climate resilience and climate vulnerability, all our projects go through a rigorous climate assessment where we quantify down to the last ton of CO2 how much is being emitted, and look at how that project is being resilient against these climate shocks. And finally, on the development side of things, I mean, we are not in the business of funding, for instance, an LNG plant where the objective is just to extract the LNG and sell it offshore. No, we want to see that there is some local utilization and development from that project as well. So we do look at things like the actual on-the-ground development impact. Are you doing things such as clean cooking? Are you using some of that LNG for industrialization locally and local gas to power as well? So those are the kind of projects where you can really hit all three objectives at once. And I think that if us as financiers start to demand that from the market, then the market itself will course correct. And we're already seeing a little bit of that. We're seeing sponsors who come to us with an oil and gas project, and they say, look, I realize that this is going to be burning fossil fuels and there's going to be some CO2 emissions, but in addition to my project, what I will do voluntarily is I'll plant some trees, I'll distribute some cook stoves. So there's a lot of innovation in that space that is very good to see.
I really like the clean cooking theme, and even like the jobs creation that seems to be running not just in this panel, but everything that we've heard since yesterday. So Rita, back to you. So as we talk about partnerships, how then do you see US-Africa partnerships evolving to strengthen Africa's energy sovereignty while ensuring mutual benefit?
I think the key word you just said there was mutual benefit. No one is looking at one going alone on any project, but also two, it doesn't matter which official you're talking to, you've got to ensure that each side is getting what they need. I always say you got to look at who they're serving. In the U.S., we're serving the American people, because that's where the funding comes from. And so when you look at, say, an agency like XM, which is 90 years old, you say, what kind of role can we play in this ability for us to work together? I think it boils down for we spend a lot of time on co-financing structures, ensuring that we with other ECAs could come together and often offer what we would call a one-stop shop, because we want to ensure that we can, as organizations, which would be two countries, basically institutions coming together, we wanted to always align, whether it was on diligence, we wanted to align on ESG, we wanted the procurements to be speeded up so that we could actually move from execution to implementation. But the thing that I think is critical from a mutual benefit perspective is what value were we all bringing to each other? And the value that, say, an organization that was 90 years old like XM would bring is that it's an institution, once the private investor or the private sector would see XM involved, they believe that we would be standing behind those particular deals. The institutions like XM also stands behind African sovereigns. We spend a lot of time talking about sovereign guarantees because at the end of the day, on both sides, we want to give some comfort to investors that the long-term deals are going to be performed. And so when we would look at, there's not a conversation that you can be entering into and from a selfish perspective. You really have to enter into the conversation about what it's going to mean on both sides. It wouldn't matter what official I was talking to at whatever level, local, regional, or federal. It was also that conversation always began and end about what were we going to do for each other. And one of the most telling parts of that is the jobs that we could be able to create, as well as how would we going to be helping the local communities in each country, especially from small business, from the small business angle, to making sure that SMEs had the ability to participate. So there's some central themes that would be, kind of running through a lot of the work that we would do.
Thank you. Lungile, so we're going to come to impact and responsibility, right? How can Africa avoid extractive models from the past and instead build inclusive and sustainable energy systems? Piggybacking off Rita just said about building local community capabilities, how do you as an investor ensure that the benefits actually reach, the local communities?
Let me start off by saying that Africa needs to be more inward looking. Our salvation is not going to come from the heavens or any external partners. It's going to come from ourselves. And I like what the former minister, raised about being a bloc and looking at your regional strengths. And a very simple example of this is that when it was the negotiations around the Paris agreements and your NDCs, you had individual African countries going to negotiate and setting targets, but the EU went as a bloc because the EU understands that they're interconnected and they understand that they need each other in order to actually survive. So they went there and they said, as a bloc, this is where we are. There are those who use hydro, there are those who use gas, there are those who use nuclear, but solar, wind, and this is how we're going to transition. In Africa, because we went in with this individual mindset, individual country, we're now getting caught up in issues of a country needs to develop, whether it's Mozambique, whether it's Namibia, but all of a sudden there are these targets that they've placed on themselves and they're not able to actually move on. Whereas if you look at the Southern African region, you've got gas, Mozambique, you've got hydro in Mozambique, also Zambia, Zimbabwe. In South Africa, you've got coal, you've got nuclear, you've got solar, Namibia solar. As a region, we could have partnered better to drive what we're looking for. The other big thing around extractive industries, typically when we speak of extractive industries, we like to speak about oil and gas. But the only way that you're going to make some of the components that are required for solar is by being extractive also, right? And we're seeing this like in mining areas, whether it's batteries, lithium, et cetera. And the question then becomes, in the entire energy value chain, not just in a technology, how are we ensuring that we're not extractive? And the key thing is around beneficiation, it's around ownership, it's around long-term strategies, vision, regional cooperation, understanding that if we work together and we say nothing leaves here that is not a complete product, we're not going to be shipping bits and pieces or raw materials. It's going to be components, it's going to be technology is what's leaving Africa. Unless we get to that point, we will continue to be an extractive, or people will continue to extract from Africa.
I know we have just about 5 minutes left, so I will try and balance the remaining 3 questions. So, Wale, this is a double-edged question. What responsibilities do financiers and governments share to ensure that their energy projects deliver on the social and environmental impact alongside of returns? And do you think that the current ESG standards are enough or sufficient, or do we need Africa-specific frameworks?
Yeah, I think that both financiers and governments share a joint responsibility to make sure energy projects really create value. For financiers, I think the responsibility starts with how we actually deploy our capital. So at AFDB, every project goes through a rigorous environmental and social due diligence screening, as well as a climate screening. And we require that there's community consultations to the extent that people are being displaced, that there's resettlement action plans, that there's consent forms signed with each of the project affected people, even before we go to board. And we also need to, beyond the environmental side of things, also, like I mentioned earlier, look at the number of jobs created and ensure and encourage that the sponsors are thinking about local labor, thinking about employment for youth and women as well. And we also reward our clients for hitting those kinds of targets. So, you can have concessionary financing available to you as a developer if you hit these certain development and ESG metrics. I think for governments, the responsibility is to set and enforce very clear and predictable standards, strong regulatory frameworks, very transparency in terms of permitting and monitoring mechanisms as well. And they also need to ensure that, these projects aren't just extracting value and taking it elsewhere, but also developing the country as well. In terms of ESG standards and whether they're applicable, there are many standards, right? There's Equator Principles, there's IFC, there's etc. But I think that for Africa, our environmental standards and ESG standards more broadly needs to look beyond a do no harm approach and actually take the approach of how do we enhance the value to the community and to the country beyond just developing the actual project. So how do we leave the country in a better state than when we found it?
And Rita, so just listening to Wale, we've got the perspective of financier on the continent. We think about institutions like EXIM. What responsibilities do you think EXIMs and others like it have to ensure that partnerships with Africa contribute then to sustainable and equitable development?
One of the things that we really had to understand is that as folks were coming in, different project sponsors, different institutions, different countries, people want to come in and everybody has a great project. Well, at least everybody thinks they have a great project. And we start out from the premise that they do have a great project and there's a great need. But how are we going to get them to bankability? How are we going to make sure that as we are talking and meeting and working with them, that they know that we have our own set of standards that we have to abide by? And the most important thing is that projects want to abide by them. The thing that I would always say to people is, they start coming in, they start talking about how many megawatts a project is going to do. But at the end of the day, you heard what Wally said. We're looking at job creation. We're looking at the ability for SME participation. We're looking at youth. We're looking at women involved in these particular projects. And so we have to balance a lot of areas in order to get to the finish line. But the most important thing that we balance is the need for us to really deploy the capital that our U.S. Congress has asked us to do, ensuring that we would be supportive of not only just U.S. business who wants to export, but foreign businesses who want to purchase goods and services from the U.S. And so once you are able to get past some of those, you get past some of those requirements, now you can actually say, does this really fit in? Whose plan is this really fitting in? And so it's always very important to understand where does this fit with the leadership of any country in terms of what it is that they're trying to do. Because if they haven't really went to the sovereign and made sure that this is a priority project, a lot of times those projects, they linger. And the most important thing is that you want to push through these projects because they take a long time. And you're going to be deploying a lot of capital behind them, and you want to have the greatest impact that you can have.
Thank you. I'm going to ask His Excellency to give us a 1-minute answer. Now that you've heard from our financiers and our investors, as a policymaker, for folks who are just getting into policy development, what sort of advice would you give them based on what we've heard from Wale, Rita, and Lungile in designing frameworks that will work not only for a country like Egypt, but as we start to think regionally for the continent?
Well, I think that we have a very good understanding of what's happening, and I think that there is a clarity of the different challenges, and I think that we know what we need. And I think and I believe that this is the time for Africa. It is only a matter of willingness and perseverance. We have the tools, we have the resources, whether it is natural resources or human resources. What it needs only is the will and the belief that we can do the difference and we can make a big change in the future. So this is the time for Africa, and I think we all know that now. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to my wonderful panelists for your very insightful contributions. We've explored energy sovereignty from a perspective of governance, investment, institutional finance, and international trade. And like His Excellency said, right, achieving this vision or the future that we want, we have the vision, we will collaborate, we have no choice but to collaborate, and we all have the conviction, right? And so as we leave today, I hope we can take some of the insights that we heard to continue to power Africa's future from within ourselves and in our respective organizations. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Eleanor Okubor, for brilliantly facilitating the session. Thank you to all of our panelists, ladies and gentlemen. If we could give them a round of applause for this very rich conversation around Africa's resource wealth and establishing energy sovereignty. I'm going to ask you please to all stand up so we